You'd be surprised how many women in Victorian England were considered scary just for owning a cat. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we're slipping into a quieter kind of ghost story. Not the kind with rattling chains, but the kind with empty parlors, worn gloves, and an extra chair that no one ever sits in. It was the age of Queen Victoria Empire and Industrial Revolution, but also of tightly wound social expectations. And for the women who didn't marry, life could feel like a long wait in a room no one entered. What happens when society decides your story should end before it begins? If slow unravelings and silent resistance sound like your kind of tale, go ahead and gently tap, like, and subscribe. We'll be lingering in the drawing room of forgotten history all night. Have you ever wondered what your great-great-aunt's least favorite aunt was really up to? This might be her story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the crowded imagination of Victorian England, a single woman was more than just unmarried. She was unfinished. The label of spinster didn't just indicate a woman who had not wed. It suggested a sort of social blemish. Not quite a tragedy, not quite a scandal, but something quietly unsettling. You walk into a parlor, and she's already there pouring weak tea not quite meeting your eye. Not rude, but not right either. Victorian novels often portrayed the spinster as a figure of pity or ridicule. She might be a comically prim aunt with too many cats or a sad soul knitting alone in a dim corner. But real-life spinsters were far more complex and far more numerous than these stereotypes suggest. By the late 19th century census, data revealed that nearly 1 in 4 women in England over the age of 30 remained unmarried. This wasn't always by choice. In fact, historians point to several systemic causes. There were simply fewer men to go around, thanks to a combination of emigration, colonial expansion, and the bloody churn of imperial wars. Women were expected to wait and wait and wait for a suitor who might never arrive. Meanwhile, society treated their single status as both a personal failing and a public oddity. In drawing rooms and dinner parties, unmarried women were watched closely. Too opinionated, she must be bitter. Too quiet, probably lonely. Too well-read, suspicious. The ideal Victorian woman was meant to be someone else's wife, someone else's mother. Without those roles, the spinster was cast adrift from the social script. And yet, there she was in every village, town, and city making do. Finding rhythms. Sometimes she was a governess, sometimes a companion, sometimes just the odd one out at family gatherings. Her clothes weren't fashionable, her stories weren't repeated, and her name rarely made the family tree. But she endured. A curious detail, the term spinster originally referred to a woman who spun thread for a living. Over time, the word stuck as a legal category for unmarried women on official documents. What had been a trade became a verdict. Modern scholars debate whether the term spinster was always pejorative or whether it occasionally held traces of quiet autonomy. Was the spinster pitied or feared, admired or ignored? There is no scholarly consensus on whether these women were seen as failed domestics or unexpected rebels. What's certain is that they lived within the tight seams of Victorian morality and occasionally tugged at the threads. Most spinsters didn't plan to be spinsters. They simply ran out of options, or rather the options quietly ran out on them. You see, in Victorian England, the math of marriage wasn't sentimental. It was statistical, and the numbers just didn't add up. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain found itself with a generation where women outnumbered men by hundreds of thousands. That imbalance worsened as the 19th century wore on. Emigration siphoned off even more bachelors, sending them to colonies in search of fortune farmland, or simply distance. Australia, Canada, South Africa. If there was a chance to strike out on one's own, young men took it, the women. They mostly stayed behind, tied to parents' propriety and the piano lessons no one paid for anymore. In this lopsided landscape, marriage became a lottery ticket with shrinking odds. For middle-class girls, the stakes were even higher. Marrying down to a tradesman, a clerk, or heaven forbid, a farm laborer risked social shame. Marrying up required looks luck and a generous dowry. But with more women than men, the market was flooded. Courtship became competitive, and quiet girls from modest homes often slipped through the cracks entirely. Imagine being 28, educated just enough to be particular, but not wealthy enough to tempt suitors. You attend dances and tea parties, nod politely, and watch younger girls get snapped up. Your friends marry, their letters change, their addresses change. You remain. By 1851, the British census showed a significant rise in women over 30 who had never married, nearly 1 in 4. It wasn't a fad. It was a demographic drift. People noticed. Periodicals published moral warnings about surplus women, and pastors gave sermons urging ladies not to be too choosy. But the surplus wasn't caused by pickiness. It was caused by gunpowder ships and a global empire that scattered men like dandelion fluff. One curious piece of evidence: in 1857, a group of evangelical reformers founded the Female Middle Class Emigration Society, specifically designed to ship unmarried women to the colonies where husbands were in short supply. Think of it as a genteel mail-order bride program with corsets and character references. Historians still argue whether this scheme was an act of mercy or quiet desperation. Either way, it made headlines. Some scholars suggest the panic over unmarried women reflected a deeper anxiety that society didn't know what to do with educated, unattached women who weren't tied to children or a husband. They were free-floating agents in a culture built on domestic anchors. That kind of independence, unclaimed and uncontained, was unsettling. And so, the math kept failing them. Every dance card half-filled, every letter unanswered, every year slipping quietly by. These women didn't wear signs around their necks, but they felt marked just the same. Not by scandal, not by failure, but by subtraction. An absence of something everyone expected, a space that no one knew how to speak into. The world didn't end for these women. It just narrowed. One missed proposal at a time. You arrive at the door after a long walk, your boots muddy, your cheeks flushed from the London air, and there it is again. The steep staircase, the worn banister, the slight scent of boiled cabbage drifting from someone else's supper. Welcome home. Well, sort of. For many unmarried women in Victorian England, the boarding house became a reluctant sanctuary. Not the sort of sanctuary with peace and quiet, mind you, but the kind where survival came wrapped in thin walls and weaker tea. In cities swelling with workers and widows, boarding houses sprang up by the hundreds, subdividing once grand homes into makeshift nests of the unpaired. You'd rent by the week or the month, depending on your savings. The room might have once been a gentleman's library or a nursery. Now it held a narrow bed, a washstand, a moth-nibbled curtain, and the thinnest slice of privacy imaginable. Your neighbors were other women like you, governesses between posts, retired ladies living off their brother's grudging allowance, and the occasional eccentric who muttered to her potted fern. Meals were taken in the communal dining room, if the place had one. They weren't leisurely affairs. You didn't linger over the toast, lest the landlady think you were idling, and you certainly didn't speak too loudly. Voices carried through these walls, and gossip fluttered faster than the coal dust in the curtains. One overlooked detail: many of these homes had what were called backstairs, narrow servant staircases tucked behind the main ones. Spinsters often used them, even when they weren't servants. It was unspoken, but understood their presence in the household was necessary, but best kept discreet. Some accounts describe boarding house routines in almost military terms. Bells for breakfast, strict rules about visitors, and the ever-watchful eye of the landlady who doubled as both matron and moral authority. It wasn't unusual for women to be warned about staying out past dusk or having male visitors, even if the men were brothers or cousins. Reputation was a fragile thing, and no one wanted whispers starting at the bread table. Historians still debate the psychological toll of such living arrangements. Were they stifling or oddly liberating? Did the proximity of others ease the loneliness or only magnify it? Some scholars point to letters and journals that reveal a kind of resigned camaraderie. Women who shared tips on keeping warm in drafty rooms or recipes for penny pudding that stretched meager rations. One quirky custom many boarding house residents would hang lace curtains, even if their windows faced brick walls. It wasn't about the view, it was about dignity, a bit of prettiness in a space that wasn't truly their own. And so, in the hush between the rattle of dishes and the ticking of someone else's borrowed clock, life went on. It wasn't the drawing room drama of Victorian novels. There were no proposals in moonlit gardens here. Just the scratch of a pen, the sigh of stairs, and a quiet resilience that didn't need applause. There's something peculiar about living in someone else's house and still being expected to raise their children as if they were your own. You walk a tightrope loved but never fully included, trusted but always watched. Such was the daily grind of the Victorian governess. You rise early, always before the family, always before the maids. The kettle is only just beginning to hiss when you tiptoe down the hall to fetch your lesson books. Today it's French verbs, botanical sketches, and perhaps some geography if the youngest isn't in one of her moods. You don't eat with the family. You don't dine with the servants. You occupy a third lonelier world above the kitchen, below the drawing room. The governess held a strange in-between status in the Victorian household. Educated, articulate, and often from a good family, fallen on hard times, she was expected to bring culture and discipline to the children without ever influencing the adults. A ghost in the nursery, a fixture in the hall. Unlike housemaids or cooks, the governess was sometimes invited to family outings or holidays, but not quite as a guest. More like intellectual luggage. She could be dismissed for too much friendliness or too little charm. One misplaced smile at the wrong dinner guest, and your employment might vanish with the next morning's post. There was no union, no pension, and rarely any upward mobility. Some women worked as governesses for decades, only to be replaced by a younger model as soon as the children outgrew their primers. If lucky, a former pupil might marry into money and offer a position as a companion. If not back to the boarding house, you'd go. One curious detail, governesses were often forbidden from forming friendships with the household staff. The logic was that such connections could undermine authority in the schoolroom or invite gossip. But isolation was the true result. Many lived in near silence, speaking more to their needlework than to another soul. Some journals from the time described the crushing monotony of the role. One woman wrote that her greatest luxury was taking tea alone in her room, a brief reprieve from correcting penmanship and being corrected in turn by the lady of the house. Scholars continue to debate whether the governess was a symbol of female education's potential, or a cautionary tale about its limits. She was independent, but only within the constraints of someone else's roof. She was respectable, but only if she stayed perfectly invisible. And yet, there was dignity in her labor. In the hours spent guiding small hands across copybooks, in the whispered stories at bedtime, in the quiet pride of seeing a child recite her first poem. The governess left her mark not in portraits or family trees, but in the habits and manners of the next generation. She walked corridors she could never claim as her own, but in them she left footprints nonetheless. There's a softness to the phrase family duty, but for many Victorian spinsters it meant unpaid lifelong labor with no job title, no salary, and no days off. You didn't just live with your parents. You became their second spine, their spare hands, their nursemaid, their cook. And when your siblings had children or misfortunes, you picked up those burdens too. You weren't the mother, but you raised them. You weren't the wife, but you cleaned up after them. You were always there in the background, like a coat hook or a kettle useful, expected invisible. This quiet servitude began young. Perhaps you stayed home to help with an ailing parent while your brothers went off to school or apprenticeships. Maybe your mother depended on you to soothe her nerves, read aloud, or manage the younger children. Decades passed like that, one small request at a time. By the time you were 35, it was too late for marriage, too late for career training, and often too late to leave. Even if your parents' past the habit of service stuck, you'd move in with a sister overwhelmed by her brood, or help a cousin through widowhood. Your bag stayed packed, ready for the next emergency that required a helpful hand. It was never a profession, but it consumed your life like one. One telling quirk in census records, many single women listed their occupation as living with relatives. Not domestic servant, not companion, just living. A euphemism that disguised a mountain of unpaid labor in polite syllables. Surviving letters from such women often strike a tone of resigned affection. Mama is much improved since my arrival, one might write, or I shall stay until Jane's confinement is over. But behind the pleasantries you can feel the years stretching out unclaimed. Historians remain divided on whether these women saw themselves as trapped or simply dutiful. Some argue they found pride in their usefulness. Others suggest that duty became a veil covering over the loss of choices they never got to make. Either way, their contributions were seldom acknowledged. They weren't remembered in wills rarely mentioned in family memoirs, and often buried in shared graves. A common trope in Victorian fiction was the maiden aunt, kind-hearted eccentric, always there with a pot of jam or an embroidered handkerchief. But the real women behind that stereotype were far more varied and far more exhausted. Their days weren't filled with lace and lemon cakes. More likely, they were organizing laundry, counting pennies, and wondering if anyone noticed they hadn't left the house in a week. And yet, in their own quiet way, they held entire households together. They were the ones who knew where the spare buttons were, who remembered birthdays, who kept tempers soothed and teacups full. They lived lives without applause. But if they hadn't, the whole show might have come undone. You step outside bonnet tied, just so gloves tugged over hands that tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the absurd vigilance of it all. You're going to post a letter. That's it. Just a 10-minute walk to the red box on the corner. And yet every footstep feels watched. Victorian society had 1,000 unwritten rules for women's modesty, and spinsters bore the brunt of them. A married woman might stroll with her husband arm in arm. A widow could walk solemnly wrapped in black with society's sympathy. But an unmarried woman alone. Every glance, every step, every errand, subject to scrutiny. You pass two matrons leaning in close beneath their parasols. They nod politely, but the hush that follows says everything. Were you out too long yesterday? Did you greet the grocer too warmly? Was that a new trim on your walking dress? These are the small trespasses that feed gossip. In cities unmarried, women were advised to avoid certain streets, certain hours, and certain topics of conversation. Even their gait was considered a moral signal too fast, and you were bold, too slow, and you looked aimless. Just right meant being nearly invisible. One overlooked rule always carries something: a letter, a parcel, a basket. Being visibly on an errand made your outing appear respectable. Wandering for pleasure was suspect, especially if you smiled, especially if you looked at birds or shop windows or clouds. In smaller towns, the scrutiny could be sharper. A woman alone was a deviation from the norm, and deviations drew attention. Some households employed maids not for the work, but simply so the unmarried daughter would never be seen walking alone. Dignity required accompaniment. There's still debate among historians about how deeply these norms shaped women's psyches. Some argue that the constant pressure made women internalize a sense of shame around independence. Others suggest that quiet forms of rebellion, like lingering just a little longer in a park, offered moments of psychological freedom. A curious little detail etiquette guides of the time often advised women not to look up while walking. The logic a downward gaze was feminine, humble, safe. But it also meant spinsters missed out on sunset's architecture and friendly faces, a whole world avoided by design. Some women circumvented scrutiny by walking with children. Nieces, students, neighbor girls. A child gave them purpose, a prop, a social shield. But even then, the watchful eyes remained. After all, who was watching the spinster one woman's diary records her fear of sneezing on a public street. It might draw attention, she wrote, and I am tired of being seen. Imagine carrying that kind of visibility like a weight every day. And so, the simple act of walking became a dance of control. Don't be too fast. Don't be too free. Don't be too alone. Above all, don't be noticed. Still, the postbox glows ahead, bright red against the soot-colored world. You slide in the letter, lower your eyes, and turn back toward a house that isn't really yours. But at least you got out today. Dressing each morning wasn't about vanity. It was a quiet performance. Each layer, each stitch, each muted color was a message: I know my place. Victorian spinsters didn't wear the bright silks of debutantes or the glittering jewels of society wives. Instead, they inhabited a palette of modesty drab grays, soft browns, faded lavenders. Unmarried but unmissable in their subdued splendor. You stand before a cloudy mirror, pulling on gloves already worn at the fingertips. Your bonnet's ribbon is carefully pressed, though it frays ever so slightly at the edge. The hem of your dress carries the memory of last week's walk through wet leaves. You take a small brush to it, humming softly. But you know what people see, not disrepair, but spinsterhood, stitched in thread. Victorian society viewed clothing as a form of moral language. A woman's attire spoke volumes about her character, income, and intentions. For the unmarried, modesty was mandatory. Anything too fine risked accusations of vanity. Anything too worn invited pity, or worse, scorn. The trick was to vanish into the middle ground. There's a strange beauty in the detail. Dresses were often hand-mended with loving precision, tiny invisible stitches keeping sleeves intact. Gloves were darned hats, reshaped with new ribbon lace collars, starched just enough to suggest dignity without flash. These were not fashion choices. They were survival tactics. One curious custom: many spinsters wore jet jewelry, not just in mourning, but year-round. Black jet was considered both respectable and somber. A brooch at the throat or earrings shaped like tiny tears, ornamentation that whispered, I'm not trying to be noticed. Some scholars believe the popularity of jet among unmarried women reflected a kind of social camouflage. And the shoes. Always practical, always a little too tight, because buying new ones was expensive and scandalous unless the old pair was visibly ruined. Imagine measuring your steps to keep soles from thinning too fast. Even walking became an act of preservation. Researchers continue to debate whether these style choices were empowering or imposed. Did spinsters find comfort in this uniform of restraint? Or did they shrink beneath it, slowly disappearing, thread by thread? Letters from the time suggest both were true. Some women express fondness for the dignity of simple dress, while others resented the way their clothes marked them as less. What they wore wasn't just about fashion. It was about signaling that they weren't a threat. Not to husbands, not to daughters, not to propriety. Their clothing was soft armor, stitched from expectation and silence. And yet, even in these limitations, there was artistry. A carefully darned cuff could hold pride. A faded shawl might carry the scent of lavender from a garden long gone. These garments became diaries worn rather than written. So you button the last button, you smooth the front, You take one last look, not for approval, but for symmetry. And when you step out the door, no one sees rebellion, but you feel it in the tilt of your hat, in the quiet dignity of looking exactly as they expect, and feeling more than they'll ever know. The candle flickers low, casting odd shadows across the wallpaper. You're curled in a chair too old for comfort, spine bent slightly, eyes scanning the same paragraph for the third time. The house is quiet, too quiet, and outside fog creeps along the window pane. But within the thin yellow light of your candle, you are somewhere else entirely. Perhaps ancient Rome, perhaps the Moors, perhaps in a story where women are allowed to choose. For many Victorian spinsters, books weren't just entertainment, they were escape. In an era when independence was rare and ambition discouraged reading, offered a doorway out. You might be overlooked at the dinner table, dismissed at the dressmakers, ignored at church. But in your private hours, you were Joan of Arc, Elizabeth Bennet, or Scheherazade. Fiction, especially novels, surged in popularity during the 19th century. Lending libraries sprang up across cities and towns, allowing women to borrow the latest titles for a small subscription fee. It was in these dusty, paper-scented shops that many spinsters found their most loyal companions' books. And yet, society didn't always approve. A single woman with her nose constantly buried in pages. Suspicious. What was she learning? What was she imagining? Could it be gasp, romantic thoughts, dangerous ideas, satirical laughter? One particularly curious fact: some moralists feared that novels might erode a woman's sense of reality. A common warning claimed that excessive reading made young women unfit for domestic life. Some scholars even blamed spinsterdom on too many Gothic romances, as though Dracula himself had drained all hope of marriage from the reader. Of course, this only made novels more alluring, especially the ones with scandalous heroines and unresolved endings. But books weren't always about fantasy. Many spinsters turned to nonfiction too: biographies, travelogues, scientific essays. They learned about volcanoes, Napoleonic wars, medieval embroidery techniques. They built private kingdoms of knowledge unspoken and unshared. Their minds traveled farther than their feet ever could. Still, even reading came with limitations. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, and too much light after dusk could be deemed wasteful or worse, indulgent. So, the clever spinster rationed her hours: a few chapters before bed, a stolen morning page, a pocket-sized volume tucked into her reticule for longer errands. Historians continue to explore whether this self-education had long-term impacts on women's agency. Some argue it laid the intellectual groundwork for later feminist movements. Others see it as a private rebellion that never quite reached the surface, books read but not spoken of. And yet, late at night, the page turned. Ideas bloomed. A different world opened up in the flicker and hush. You weren't sitting in a rented attic room anymore. You were in Constantinople or on a battlefield, or locked in debate with Cicero himself. There's a letter from one spinster that simply reads, "I go to bed each night in a place that does not exist." That place was her story, her solace, her escape hatch. And when the candle burned low and the dream dimmed with the flame, she'd mark her page. Carefully, quietly. Tomorrow, she'd return. There's an odd comfort in talking to a cat that never interrupts you, or kneeling beside a patch of time that grows exactly as expected. For many Victorian spinsters, solace came not from society, but from the smaller, quieter corners of their world gardens and animals that required nothing but care and consistency. You wake early before the house stirs. There's a certain magic in those moments when the world hasn't yet noticed you're awake. You slip out to the backyard, perhaps not even a yard, just a sliver of green behind the boarding house or family cottage. The soil is cool, damp beneath your fingers. The parsley looks cheerful. The mint is misbehaving again. For women with little autonomy, gardening offered a rare form of control. You could decide where to plant, how much to water, when to prune. You didn't need permission to compost carrot peels or clip dead heads. It was your space even if it was the size of a coffin lid. Likewise, pets became cherished companions, not extravagant ones, mind you. No purebred hounds or parading parrots. But a quiet tabby rescued from a rainy alley, a goldfinch in a modest cage, a terrier with one eye and far too much energy. These creatures offered affection without judgment and presence without expectation. One curious trend, many unmarried women named their pets after classical figures: Homer, Minerva, Julius, Cleopatra. Historians think this was less about pretension and more about hidden wit. If society denied you a family of your own, why not create one with literary flair? But these small pleasures weren't always respected. A woman too fond of animals might be whispered about. Was she eccentric? Was she losing touch? Spinsters and their cats became a shorthand joke even then. Satirical cartoons from the era often depicted solitary women surrounded by meowing beasts peering madly out from behind lace curtains. Yet, behind those curtains, the reality was gentler. There are diary entries that speak of long afternoons spent reading aloud to a cat or carefully replanting a marigold damaged by frost. One woman wrote, "I spoke to the ivy today. It seemed to listen. Eccentric maybe, or maybe just someone seeking conversation that wouldn't be turned into critique." Scholars debate how widespread these private rituals were. Were they acts of quiet defiance or simply coping mechanisms for a life stretched thin with solitude? There's no clear answer, but the frequency of these anecdotes suggests they matter deeply. And when dusk fell and the house closed in with its sighs and silences, these tiny allies remained. The cat curled warm on the coverlet. The thyme released its scent beneath the window. A cup of lukewarm tea. A journal entry that started today: Minerva caught a moth. These weren't grand gestures or sweeping triumphs. They were the soft, persistent joys that threaded through lives often overlooked. Not a rebellion, but a rhythm. Not noise, but a hum. And in that hum, the spinster found something precious peace in her own peculiar company. There's a certain kind of friendship that feels like a hearth low-burning, steady, and warm, even when the rest of the world grows cold. For many Victorian spinsters, such friendships weren't merely pleasant diversions. They were lifelines. In a society that framed women's worth through husbands and children, deep bonds between unmarried women offered a quiet, enduring alternative. You sit across from her, two teacups between you, steam rising like whispered secrets. She knows what you mean without needing to say it. She too walked to the postbox under watchful eyes. She too has gloves darned twice over. Together you've read the same novel, sighed at the same newspaper, headline laughed at the absurdity of things that should not be spoken aloud. While men wrote of comradeship in war or the brotherhood of clubs, women forged companionships over sewing tables, shared book margins, and long letters. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were chosen families. Some lived together, 2 or 3 unmarried women, pooling incomes to rent a cottage or townhouse. Others remained apart, bound by epistolary devotion. Letters passed weekly, even daily. Inside, they shared recipes, neighborhood gossip, poems, doubts, and occasionally declarations of profound emotional attachment cloaked in the era's flowery prose. One particularly tender detail: pressed flowers. These were often sent between friends as bookmarks or quiet tokens. A sprig of lavender from a summer walk. A violet hidden in the folds of a letter. They spoke of memory, constancy, and care beyond words. Historians continue to debate the nature of these relationships. Were they platonic, romantic, something in between? The Victorian language of affection complicates the answer. I love you might simply mean I trust you with my thoughts. Some scholars refer to these partnerships as Boston marriages, borrowing the American term for two women who live together in a long-term supportive relationship, often economically and emotionally intertwined. Regardless of definition, these bonds mattered. They provided structure, meaning, and often joy in lives that otherwise might have been shadowed by isolation. And unlike romantic marriages, these friendships weren't arranged or expected. They were chosen again and again through illness, through aging, through the slow erosion of time. One surviving letter reads, "Without your Tuesdays, I think I might go quite mad." Another, "Even the sound of your handwriting steadies me." Imagine a connection so vital that even the scrawl of ink could soothe. Of course, not all such bonds were idyllic. Jealousy, unspoken grief, or distance could fray even the strongest ties. But the effort to preserve them, to walk 4 miles in the rain just to deliver a plum cake or to save the last of one's ink for a midnight reply, spoke volumes. These friendships weren't visible in portraits or census records. They didn't leave heirs. But they left marks in journals and garden paths worn by shared walks in the space at a tea table kept forever for one person. In a world that expected them to fade quietly into spinsterhood, these women found each other and made something enduring. Sunday morning arrives not with song, but with silence. You dress with extra care, stiff collar, polished boots, a brooch that once belonged to your grandmother. The streets glisten with dew as you walk to church alone. It's the same walk you've taken for years, past the same hedgerows, the same nodding neighbors. But inside, something feels heavier today. Church was meant to be a solace. For many spinsters, it was the only place they could go without raising eyebrows. No one questioned a woman's piety after all. Sitting in a pew offered protection, both spiritual and social. Yet it could also expose, especially when you sat alone. Married couples whispered together, mothers shushed squirming children, older widows clutched black-gloved hands, and there you were, neither child nor mother, neither wife nor widow, just present, and noticeable for it. Some congregations tried to soften the sting. Special rows were designated for unattached ladies, but this kindness could feel more like categorization. You weren't placed with family. You weren't seated with friends. You were grouped like a footnote orderly, visible quietly set apart. One peculiar custom unmarried women were often tasked with arranging flowers or helping with the Sunday school children. These duties were framed as acts of service, but they also filled space social and emotional. Doing something meant fewer questions, fewer pauses in conversation, fewer chances for someone to offer that look, half pity, half confusion. Still there was beauty to be found, the slow unfolding of hymns, the scent of candle wax and lilies, the shared pause before a prayer. For a brief moment, time slowed, and for all its judgment, the sanctuary held a certain comfort. You were part of a ritual older than your own regrets. Historians note that for many Victorian women, religious life became a substitute framework for roles they were denied elsewhere. In church, a woman could lead a choir, direct charity work, or oversee a temperance league. These roles offered purpose, identity, and occasionally respect. Some scholars argue that spinsters found in religious devotion a kind of soft authority, one that didn't challenge patriarchy directly, but carved out space within it. Others disagree. They see these roles as yet another set of expectations that constrained women's autonomy, requiring constant humility, self-sacrifice, and the quiet repression of personal longing. There's truth in both views. But for many, the pew remained a paradox, sanctuary and spotlight in equal measure. And then there was the loneliness, especially on holidays when families clustered close and empty seats echoed louder than bells. Some spinsters confessed in letters that they dreaded Christmas services most of all, not for the theology, but for the reminder of what was missing. No hand to hold, no children to corral, just polished shoes and folded gloves worn without witness. Still you bowed your head, you sang the verses, you watched the light catch the stained glass and refract it into something that almost looked like belonging. And when the service ended, you stood slowly smooth your skirt and stepped into the sunlight, alone but not unseen. The fire was no one's fault. A chimney spark, a wind-blown ember, maybe even an unattended candle. But when the neighbors gathered murmuring and speculating beneath the smoke-stained sky, their eyes all turned in one direction, toward her, the unmarried woman in the narrow house, the one who always walked alone. Victorian spinsters often lived on the edge of suspicion, not for anything they did, but simply for existing outside the norm. In a society obsessed with domestic order, a woman who lived alone or refused to marry was an anomaly, and anomalies invited blame. When the cow sickened, when a child took ill, when strange footprints appeared in the garden, someone had to be at fault. And if a woman lived nearby with no husband to vouch for her, no family to soften her edges, her name rose quickly to the surface of whispered fears. It wasn't quite witch hunting, but the echoes were there. A broken mirror, a withered crop, a letter that never arrived. Superstition slipped easily into slander, and slander into quiet exclusion. One documented case tells of a spinster who was blamed for a series of minor misfortunes in her village: cracked eggs, lost buttons, and mysteriously soured milk. No proof was ever found, but her cottage windows were broken 3 times in a single year. Eventually, she moved to the next county. Her last recorded note reads simply, "I grew tired of watching people cross themselves when I passed." Scholars debate how common this scapegoating truly was. Some argue it was confined to rural areas steeped in folklore. Others suggest it appeared even in polite society, hidden behind false smiles and social snubs. What's certain is that single women, especially those without wealth or male relatives, lived with an undercurrent of mistrust. And yet many persisted. They went about their business with quiet pride, cultivating gardens, nursing the sick, teaching children, but always with one eye turned inward, measuring every gesture, every comment for signs of disapproval. A peculiar example from London in the 1870s, a woman living alone was accused of hoarding coal during a winter shortage. No evidence supported the claim. She kept a ledger proving her purchases were legal and modest. But the neighbors had already decided. She must be up to something one wrote in a letter. She's always so quiet. There was no winning. Too loud and you were manly. Too quiet and you were secretive. Too generous and people asked what you wanted. Too private and they filled the blanks with whispers. And so many women learned to live defensively. Doors locked twice. Windows curtained at all hours. Smiles practiced in the mirror to seem warm but not inviting, helpful but not familiar. Still, every now and then, kindness broke through. A neighbor left apples on the doorstep. A child waved without prompting. A baker tucked an extra roll into the paper sack. Not everyone judged, but those who did remembered. Not what you said, not what you did, but the silence you carried and how unnerving it was to them. The paper is thin, nearly translucent from age. The ink has faded to a pale brown, but the words remain halting, hopeful, desperate in their neat loops. Dearest cousin, it begins, I wonder if perhaps you meant to write back and were delayed. It never found an answer. It was folded carefully sealed with wax and placed in a box alongside dozens of others, all unopened, all unanswered. Victorian spinsters wrote letters the way some people breathe. It was their connection to the world beyond the parlor, beyond the garden gate. Letters were social currency, emotional lifelines, diaries in disguise. And when replies didn't come, when the silence became louder than any word, it left a different kind of scar. Some letters were simple updates: I have finished knitting the scarf, and hope your cold is past. Others bared the soul. I miss our walks terribly, and sometimes I think of what might have been. Between the lines lay unspoken longing, sometimes for love, sometimes just for recognition. Post was both blessing and torment. Every morning brought the rustle of envelopes and the prick of hope. Would there be a reply today? A distant cousin, a forgotten school friend, even the landlady's niece. And when there wasn't, the silence settled like dust on the mantle, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. One curious practice many women kept copybooks where they transcribed their own outgoing letters by hand. This wasn't vanity, it was a memory aid. If no reply came, at least the words lived somewhere. They hadn't vanished completely. Some of these books survive today, providing scholars with rare glimpses into the inner lives of women who left behind little else. And what lives they reveal. One letter ends, I write not for reply, but to keep company with the past. Another addressed to a former pupil gently asks, "Do you ever think of the song I taught you, or has it vanished like all things do?" Historians debate how often these unanswered letters were acts of futility or quiet rebellion. Some argue they were simply habit routine correspondence in a world without telephones. Others see them as resistance, a refusal to let oneself be erased. A spinster may have been overlooked in society, but on the page she insisted on being heard. And then there were the letters that never had an intended recipient, the ones written and tucked away immediately. Today I am lonely and I need to say it aloud. A confession to the self, a way of organizing grief or boredom or stubborn hope. Even unopened, these letters held power. They were declarations of presence. I was here. I thought these thoughts. I missed you. I mattered, even if only to a folded piece of paper. Sometimes the writer passed away before the letter did. A neighbor cleaning out a drawer, a niece leafing through old stationery, would stumble upon a bundle tied with ribbon. No scandal, no secrets, just soft longing pressed between pages like flowers. Unread, perhaps, but never entirely unspoken. There's something chilling about a hospital room where no one comes to visit. The bed is narrow, the walls pale, the flowers, if there are any, begin to wilt by the third day. The nurse is kind, perhaps, but rushed. The other beds are occupied by strangers. You listen to their coughs, their dreams, their dying words, and wonder who might hear yours. For Victorian spinsters, old age often meant fading into institutions. Without husbands or children to care for them, many ended their days not in the warmth of a family home, but in the quiet sterility of charity hospitals, convalescent homes, or in more tragic cases, asylums. The latter weren't necessarily signs of madness, sometimes just poverty, confusion, or too many lonely nights. Hospitals of the era were stark and unsentimental. Cleanliness was prioritized, certainly, but not comfort. Iron beds, rough blankets, a shelf for your comb and prayer book. Meals were regular but bland, visitors rare. Sometimes a neighbor would stop by, or a former employer might send a parcel, but often no one came. Records from these institutions occasionally list diagnoses like melancholia or nervous exhaustion, terms now considered outdated, but which then served as convenient placeholders for anything society couldn't explain. Widow's grief, lifelong solitude, the weight of decades without touch. Asylums in particular had a dark ambiguity. Though some were progressive in their care, encouraging fresh air embroidery. Gentle walks, others were overcrowded and underfunded. A woman might be committed for wandering or excessive letter writing. Her stay could last weeks, or the rest of her life. One curious and haunting detail, many unmarried women died without anyone to claim their bodies. Hospital chaplains oversaw quiet funerals. Headstones, if they existed, bore only initials. Some were buried in mass graves marked by number, not name. Their final beds were as anonymous as the rooms they spent their last nights in. Historians differ in interpreting this final chapter. Some argue these institutions offered mercy medical care and shelter when no family remained. Others see them as places of abandonment, where society could shuffle away its inconvenient members behind clean curtains and polite silence. And yet, even within these settings, moments of tenderness appeared. A nurse who memorized a patient's favorite hymn, a roommate who whispered stories from the next cot, a final letter written shakily addressed to a niece who may or may not exist. One letter found in the archives of a London almshouse reads, "The bed is hard, but the sky through the window is kind." Another, "If no one remembers me, I still remember spring." Not all spinsters died alone, of course. Some were cared for by siblings, friends, or younger women they had mentored. But for those without such ties, the end could come softly and without ceremony. No trumpet sounds, no last words etched in marble, just the rustle of sheets, a closing door, and perhaps, if she was lucky, a hand held at the end. She had lived, quietly, fiercely against the tide, and now she rested. It would be easy to end their story with silence, to imagine the spinster's life as a long sigh fading into wallpaper. But that would be a mistake, because even within the strict seams of Victorian society, some women stitched rebellions of their own, small, strange, stubborn acts that refused to be erased. You wouldn't always notice them at first. They might still wear modest dresses, still live quietly, still sip tea at precisely 4 o'clock. But somewhere tucked between the lace and propriety was defiance. A pamphlet published under a pseudonym, a library founded in a rural town, a botanical club run from a parlor. These were the quiet rebellions of women told they had nothing to contribute and who proved otherwise. One spinster formed a society for unmarried women to share housing and pool resources decades before co-housing had a name. Another documented every wildflower in her county, pressing and labeling hundreds with scientific precision. Her work is still used by botanists today. And then there was the woman who took in stray animals, yes, but also young girls turned out by their families. Her home became a halfway house before the concept existed. Many wrote diaries, essays, even novels. Their names rarely made it onto the cover, but their words crept into drawing rooms, into minds, into history. One particularly sharp-witted governess published etiquette manuals disguised as household advice. But read closely, they offered a biting critique of gender roles, complete with footnotes in Latin. It sold well enough to warrant 3 editions. Some joined reform movements. Others taught night classes or offered literacy lessons to servants. A few even traveled abroad, writing dispatches for local papers under initials alone. These were not grand revolutions. They didn't shake thrones or raise flags. But they nudged boundaries one stitch at a time. Historians still debate how intentional these acts were. Were they conscious protests or simply ways to stay busy? Some scholars believe the spinsters who left unusual legacies did so out of frustration. Others argue it was born from purpose, from a desire to fill space denied them elsewhere. There's likely truth in both. And then there are the legacies no scholar will ever find. A joke passed down 3 generations. A quilt with initials hidden in its corner. A habit of slicing apples a certain way, carried across continents by a niece or neighbor. Not all rebellions are written in ink. One diary entry unsigned ends with this: "They say we die forgotten. But I have named things. I have planted rows. I have taught a child to read. That is enough." So no, the story doesn't end in shadow. It ends in stubborn light, not blinding, not loud, but persistent. A lamp in a window still burning after the household sleeps. A pressed violet in a borrowed book. A name whispered not in fame, but in fondness. And if you pass an old garden wall and see time growing wild and uninvited, remember some seeds were planted on purpose long ago. And just beyond the ivy wall, in another parlor warmed by quiet companionship, A different kind of rebellion was taking root, one not of solitude, but of shared hearts stitched gently together. You're standing on a cobble street lined with ivy-covered townhouses and flustered cats. It's the 1830s perhaps, 1840s, and somewhere inside one of those lace-curtained parlors, two women are sipping tea beside a hearth. No men, no husbands, just them two hearts beating in soft unison. This isn't a scandal, not exactly, but it isn't a wedding either. These were companionate bonds, deep emotional relationships between women that often rivaled and sometimes replaced traditional marriages. At a time when matrimony was more about financial security than mutual understanding, many women found richer intimacy in their closest female friend. They called it sisterhood, but it was more chosen than blood-bound. The term romantic friendship didn't exist yet, but the feelings were unmistakable jealousy when one friend married, grief when they moved away, and elation when they reunited after months apart. Some women even made formal pledges to one another, sealing their emotional fidelity in letters, lockets, or shared household chores. One quirky case often cited involves Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler, two Irish women who fled their families in the late 1700s to live together in a cottage in Wales. Neighbors gossiped, poets visited, and the two women known as the Ladies of Llangollen hosted dignitaries while living a life of domestic partnership without a single legal tie. Their house had no husbands, but it had joint gardening schedules and matching armchairs. Some scholars argue these relationships were romantic in a way we'd now recognize as queer. Others insist they were emotionally intense but non-sexual products of a society that didn't allow women many outlets for public closeness. The truth? It's hidden somewhere in half-burned diaries and embroidered initials stitched too close together. These friendships weren't hidden exactly, but they weren't explained either. Women strolled arm in arm, kissed each other's cheeks, and slept in the same bed, with a matter-of-factness that confused later generations. Today we might raise an eyebrow. Back then people raised teacups. What's certain is this: in a world where women were expected to marry men they barely liked, many found solace in one another. They built homes without blueprints, vows without altars, and love without needing to define it. Some things don't quite fit into categories like the handwritten poem that makes you blush, or the letter that smells faintly of lavender and longing. That's what romantic friendships often looked like, moments too tender to be. Just friendship too restrained to be love, as we define it now. Imagine a desk cluttered with quill pens, sealing wax and ribbon-tied bundles of paper. A woman leans over the page, choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon and the vulnerability of someone undressing in prose. These were not casual correspondences. They were outpourings, intense, lyrical, emotionally saturated messages passed between women who considered each other the emotional center of their universe. They used the language of the heart. "My dearest darling," one woman might begin. "Without your presence, the air grows thinner." Some letters included vivid dreams, spiritual metaphors, and even coded references to touch and longing. Others read like vows: "I shall never love another as I love you." Sentences that today might populate a Valentine's card were in their time filed away between cookbooks and family ledgers. Some women even wrote joint diaries, an unspoken pact to record their days together, line by line. These logs described shared breakfasts, spontaneous picnics, illnesses nursed, and silly disagreements over hairpins or hat feathers. But underneath the mundane pulsed a current of devotion, daily affirmations that this connection was something sacred. This language wasn't just emotional, it was aesthetic. Women exchanged embroidered handkerchiefs, pressed flowers, and hair brooches as tokens of affection. These weren't teenage whims. They were adult artifacts of bonds more intense and more enduring than many traditional marriages. Historians still disagree on how to interpret this flood of affectionate language. Was it simply a norm of female expression in a time when men loomed large and cold? Or was it romantic in the way we now understand the word passionate, chosen, and queer in every thread diaries rarely specify? Love letters don't come with footnotes. Take Emily Dickinson, for instance. Her letters to Susan Gilbert are often cited in this context. Susie, will you be my little wife, she wrote in one. Was it metaphor, a playful phrase, or a genuine yearning for emotional matrimony? Scholars have spent lifetimes decoding such fragments, and yet no single answer feels complete. Some argue these friendships were private sanctuaries in a world full of public constraints. A woman might never be allowed to speak candidly to her husband, but she could pour her soul into a letter to her best friend. Others say it was simply the fashion of sentimentality, a society that encouraged poetic outpourings, without necessarily expecting deeper meanings. But then again, fashion doesn't usually make you cry when the post is late. These romantic friendships weren't quiet in the heart. They just happened to live in a time when there were no clear words for what they were. So, the women wrote their own. The lamps are dim in the parlor, and there's a second teacup on the table matching the first. A clock ticks softly in the corner, but time seems irrelevant here. Two women sit side by side on a small settee, sharing not just space, but a life. This isn't a visit, it's home. This was the world of the Boston marriage. The term, despite sounding like something from a 1920s speakeasy, actually dates back to the late 19th century. It referred to two women, usually educated, financially independent, and unmarried, who lived together in a long-term household arrangement. No man was involved. That alone made them fascinating and occasionally scandalous figures in their time. Boston marriages were especially common among women in New England's intellectual and reformist circles. Many had teaching jobs or family inheritances, which gave them the financial freedom to avoid traditional marriages. Some of them were college professors. Others were social activists. All of them had made a quiet but radical choice to build a domestic life without men. They often owned property together, shared finances, and planned futures around each other's careers. In some cases, they were together for decades through sickness, social shifts, and occasional family disapproval. Their homes became sanctuaries filled with books, lace curtains, rose gardens, and the unspoken agreement that no suitor would ever cross the threshold. Historians still argue about how many Boston marriages were romantic in nature. Some scholars suggest they were early examples of same-sex partnerships masked in euphemism. Others believe they were simply deep friendships made possible by changing economic realities. The truth may live in the margins and grocery lists, scribbled in two handwritings in funeral records that name a woman as next of kin or in the absence of a wedding dress in an attic trunk. One of the most notable examples is the relationship between Henry James's sister Alice and her lifelong companion, Catherine Loring. The two women traveled together, lived together, and were rarely seen apart. Alice wrote in her diary about the serenity Catherine brought to her life, calling her my blessed sunbeam. It's not a phrase you find in most obituaries. Curiously, Boston marriages were often tolerated, even admired by society, as long as the women involved behaved with discretion. Since they didn't pose a threat to the male power structure, they slipped through the social radar cloaked in gentility. A man might raise an eyebrow, but rarely his voice. After all, these weren't rebels in trousers, they were ladies with teacups. Their lives weren't always easy. Property laws didn't favor unmarried women, and medical decisions could become fraught without legal recognition. But within their walls, they built lives of quiet intimacy, proof that you could write your own vows, even if no church heard them. And so, the Boston marriage became its own institution, one without clergy or government, but no less binding. A home made of shared decisions, silent routines, and the deep comfort of knowing that come what may, you'd never have to drink your morning coffee alone. The shutters are open just enough to let in the morning light, but not the stairs. Outside, neighbors walk past with baskets and judgments, casting side eyes and subtle nods. They say nothing aloud, but inside that tidy cottage with its matching quilts and shared parlor, the whispers have already arrived. Society didn't quite know what to make of women who lived together without husbands. The neighbors speculated, the clergy frowned, and yet no one had the vocabulary to name what they were seeing. Were these women just eccentric, or something else entirely? Gossip swirled, often draped in polite euphemism. Aunts would refer to such a living situation as an arrangement or a matter of economy. Some newspapers writing about long-standing female partnerships called them inseparable friends, with a tone that hovered between admiration and suspicion. One obituary described two women who had lived together for 40 years as companions in all things including solitude. That's code if you're paying attention. In small towns, the social calculus could be brutal. Two women buying a house together might trigger raised eyebrows at the market. If they dressed similarly or used terms of endearment in public, rumors took root like weeds. Children whispered things they didn't fully understand. Adults pretended not to notice while noticing a great deal. Sometimes even their own families expressed confusion. Letters from concerned brothers or disapproving uncles asked things like, "Don't you think it's time you settle down properly?" as if decades of cohabitation somehow didn't count. The idea of emotional fulfillment outside marriage made people uncomfortable, even when it stared them in the face over 3 courses of boiled ham and peas. Some pairs deflected the scrutiny with charm. They hosted garden parties, attended church regularly, and referred to one another in ways that softened public suspicion, my dear friend or my companion in charitable work. Others leaned into eccentricity, collecting cats, wearing matching brooches, or composing joint Christmas cards that arrived with identical calligraphy and a whiff of lavender. Of course, not all public commentary was benign. Satirical pamphlets and cartoons occasionally mocked these pairings, painting them as either tragically spinsterish or unnaturally close. Boston Wives became both a term of curiosity and quiet ridicule. One broadsheet accused a pair of women of living as though they were wed, without ever clarifying what that meant. There's no scholarly consensus on whether society understood these bonds and simply chose not to intervene, or whether they genuinely couldn't fathom a relationship that fell outside courtship norms. Some historians argue that such friendships were seen as charming relics of girlhood extended too long. Others believe they were quietly subversive, and society chose to look the other way, because acknowledging them meant grappling with discomfort. Either way, the result was the same, a hazy zone of tolerance shaped more by manners than acceptance. So, these women continued their lives, attending funerals, trimming rose bushes, managing homes, while the world around them tried to file them under categories that never quite fit. Because not every bond fits into neat lines. Some draw their own shapes, delicate, stubborn, and absolutely true. Behind the armoire, tucked in a velvet box, lies a bundle of letters tied with a silk ribbon, so worn it's nearly transparent. The ink has faded, but the words remain sharp, looping across the page like whispered vows. You aren't meant to read them, but you do. And suddenly you're intruding on something private, sacred, and impossibly tender. These letters weren't just casual notes about weather and errands. They were chronicles, emotional diaries folded into envelopes and sealed with wax perfume or dried violets. Women in romantic friendships often wrote to each other daily, even if they lived just a few streets apart. The act of writing, folding, sealing it was part of the relationship's rhythm, like brushing hair or sharing tea. Some letters read like love songs. "I kissed your name on the paper," one woman confided to her dearest friend. Another wrote, "The ache I feel when you are gone can only be soothed by your hand in mine." These weren't metaphors. These were emotional declarations, tactile proof of a bond that dared not speak its name, but embroidered it beautifully in ink. Alongside the letters came sentimental tokens, pressed flowers, miniature portraits, or embroidered handkerchiefs with each other's initials. One woman sent her companion a lock of hair, bound with a tiny silver clasp, shaped like a heart. Another gave her friend a needlebook, delicately stitched with the words, "In labor, and in rest, I am yours." These were not flirtations. They were lifelong pledges stitched and sealed with devotion. Many women kept their friends' letters beside family Bibles or in drawers with mourning jewelry, clear signs of their significance. To lose one was like losing a part of the soul. And yet, because these tokens came from women to women, they were often dismissed by later historians as mere sentimentality. The Victorian age, after all, was full of emotional flourish. But there's a difference between social convention and emotional architecture. Some of these tokens weren't just expressions, they were foundations. And in the absence of legal contracts or wedding bands, they were all the evidence that love had to offer. Surviving records show that some women requested to be buried with these items. One woman asked for her friend's letters to be placed beneath her pillow in the coffin. Another insisted that her shared diary with her companion not be passed down, but burned too intimate for even descendants to glimpse. There's something almost rebellious about that, guarding a bond from the prying eyes of history, as if to say, "You may not understand this, but it mattered." Some scholars argue that these tokens were a performative part of a larger cultural practice of female sentiment. Others point to their emotional consistency, arguing that they reflected a deeper, more complex kind of love. The debate continues circling around faded parchment and old ribbon. But hold one of those letters in your hand, feel the slight tremble in the handwriting, the careful choice of words, and you realize something simple. This wasn't just correspondence. It was commitment, written one page at a time. Picture two women strolling through a sunlit garden, skirts brushing against the lavender. One reaches for the other's hand, not with hesitation, but with the easy familiarity of someone who's done it 1,000 times. They pause beneath an arbor, faces close, and one presses a soft kiss to the other's cheek. No one gasps, no one shouts. Because in the 1800s, these gestures weren't just accepted, they were expected. In an era where physical closeness between women was not only normal, but celebrated friendship often looked like intimacy. Holding hands while walking, resting a head on a shoulder, even sleeping in the same bed, these weren't cause for alarm. They were seen as tender signs of sisterhood. The rules of Victorian decorum had many layers, but between women, the lines blurred like steam on a tea kettle. It wasn't uncommon to see women sitting together with their knees touching, brushing one another's hair, or exchanging gentle back rubs after long days. Some even shared bath water, not for efficiency, but for companionship. These gestures might raise eyebrows today, but in their time, they were simply part of the language of affection. One famous example comes from the correspondence of Mary Lyon, founder of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. In her letters to close female colleagues, she wrote of resting her head on their laps, of falling asleep, lulled by your voice and the steady rhythm of your breathing. These weren't coded erotic moments, they were expressions of comfort, safety, and emotional trust. That said, not all interactions were so innocent in intention. Some women used these intimate gestures to express deeper feelings they could never say aloud. A touch held slightly too long. A kiss given when no one was looking. A glance that lingered just a moment past the point of friendship, all subtle signals in a world where language failed. Some scholars argue that this freedom of touch actually obscured romantic desire rather than revealing it. Because women were allowed, even encouraged, to touch each other without suspicion, those who felt something more had no way to express it clearly or to know if their feelings were returned. Others suggest that these physical moments were the very heart of emotional life for many 19th century women, offering real comfort in a world of corsets, constraints, and limited choices. Modern readers often struggle to interpret these signs. Were they platonic or something more? The truth is likely both, and neither. For many women, these physical expressions were layered with meaning, a blend of affection, dependence, desire, and routine. Much like a married couple who finishes each other's sentences, these pairs didn't always need to spell things out. The body spoke for them. In the absence of legal recognition, public affirmation, or even consistent terminology, touch became the one thing they could claim without consequence. And so, they used it gently, constantly, and with a kind of reverence we might reserve for prayer, because sometimes the smallest gesture says what words never could. Step inside a small book-filled sitting room where two women are bent over a quilt pattern, heads nearly touching. One grew up in a stately Boston home with silver tea sets and French tutors. The other left school at 12 to help her mother wash linens. And yet, here they are, sewing side by side, dreaming up a shared life built from scraps. Many 19th century companion pairs came from dramatically different backgrounds. One might be upper class with a dowry tucked away and social calls to manage. The other might be working class, self-educated with ink-stained fingers and political pamphlets hidden under her pillow. Their bond, however, often bridged these divides in unexpected and deeply personal ways. Some of the most enduring friendships were formed across class lines, especially among women involved in reform movements. In abolitionist circles, temperance leagues, and early labor organizations, women found common purpose. That shared mission often transformed working relationships into chosen families. A privileged woman might offer her home as headquarters. Her less wealthy friend might bring passion, strategy, and storytelling grit. Together, they built more than just pamphlets, they built trust. Historians continue to debate whether these friendships were truly egalitarian or subtly hierarchical. Some argue that wealthier women held invisible power steering decisions or shaping public narratives. Others point out that working-class women weren't just sidekicks. They were often the logistical backbone managing the gritty realities of daily life. The dynamics were complex, and no two pairs were exactly alike. One fascinating example is the relationship between writer Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, the widow of a prominent Boston publisher. Jewett, the daughter of a small-town doctor, never married. Fields was older, well-connected, and moved easily through elite social circles. Despite their differences, they spent decades traveling, reading, and living together, maintaining separate bedrooms, but a unified domestic life that puzzled their peers. Their letters are full of references to shared books, garden walks, and emotional check-ins. "Your silence feels louder than thunder," Jewett once wrote. "I miss the exact way you fold your napkin. It's hard to reduce that kind of intimacy to mere friendship, and yet they never called it anything else. In some cases, class differences added a layer of protection. Society could dismiss these partnerships as patronage or mentorship, rather than anything more emotionally charged. A lady taking in a companion, perfectly respectable. That the companion had a key to the house and her own chair at the dining table, not mentioned. But inside those houses where one woman taught the other to read, or one managed the accounts while the other ran the household, a different truth took root. They weren't just sharing chores. They were building a life sometimes out of necessity, often out of love. They didn't need to match in birth or wealth to form a unit. Their bond was shaped by daily rituals, private jokes, and a mutual understanding that no family tree could manufacture. Because chosen family isn't drawn with blood, it's stitched together by choice, day after quiet day. The parlor looks the same as ever, chintz curtains, porcelain figurines. A chessboard paused mid-game, but the air has changed. One woman sits stiffly in a chair pretending to read. The other paces the room, not quite angry, but hurt in a way that only silence can sharpen. Something is wrong, and neither will say it aloud. Jealousy, it turns out, isn't reserved for lovers. Among companion pairs, it often arrived like an uninvited guest, clinking teacups and fraying nerves. These weren't polite rivalries. They were quiet heartbreaks, often written into the margins of diaries with shaking hands and smudged ink. When a third woman entered the picture, perhaps a new friend, a coworker, or even a sister, emotions ran high. Suddenly, long-held routines were interrupted. Was the morning walk taken without you? Was the new letter too quickly replied to? Even the smallest slights could feel like betrayal when one person had become your entire emotional world. Some diary entries describe these triangles in language more intense than any love poem. She laughs now, as she once laughed, only for me, wrote one heartbroken woman about her friend's growing closeness to someone new. Another noted, "She has given my book to another. I have become background music to her new symphony." These weren't isolated flares of drama. Many pairs experienced periods of rupture where accusations of neglect, shifting affections, or perceived slights strained their connection. And yet, just as often, they found their way back through tearful letters, emotional reconciliations, or carefully orchestrated afternoon teas meant to signal forgiveness. Some scholars suggest these emotional storms were proof of romantic undercurrents. Others believe they stemmed from the intensity of social isolation. In a world where women had few emotional outlets outside their domestic circle, their friendships bore the full weight of every hope, disappointment, and insecurity. They didn't just share their hearts, they handed them over, unwrapped. One particularly vivid case involved three women who lived together in the 1880s, keeping a rotating diary. The pages started warmly shared meals, synchronized sewing projects, affectionate nicknames. But as time passed, entries began to bristle. One woman documented the coldness of her gaze, while another complained that her gifts were politely received, then set aside like dust. The diary ended abruptly with no explanation. A trio unthreaded. Still, these emotional highs and lows weren't signs of dysfunction. They were in many ways a mirror of married life, minus the rings and legal paperwork. Disagreements, reconciliations, and jealousy were part of the terrain. The difference was that society had no script for how to handle them. There was no couples therapy for best friends, no etiquette manual on what to do when your closest companion stopped meeting your eyes. And so, these women navigated their own heartbreaks quietly, often eloquently, occasionally with passive-aggressive embroidery. A handkerchief stitched with forget-me-not could mean anything from longing to accusation. But even in jealousy, there was proof of love, because you don't grieve what you don't care for. And in those teacup wars and diary battles, the depth of feeling was never in doubt, only its direction. There's something oddly telling about how people write obituaries. A life gets boiled down to a few short paragraphs: birth, death, a line about hobbies, maybe a quote from scripture. But occasionally, in the quiet corners of these formal notices, something slips through, a phrase too poetic, a tribute too tender, and suddenly you're reading between the lines of a bond that society never fully understood. In the 19th century, when women in companionate friendships passed away, their surviving partners often found subtle ways to preserve their memory without inviting scandal. Public tributes became a kind of coded language, allowing grief to speak without being interrogated. A woman might be referred to as beloved friend and housemate of 30 years, or constant presence and daily comfort. Sometimes the obituary wasn't for one woman, but for the life they had built together. One newspaper printed a memorial describing a woman's passing as the sun setting on a household of two, a line more suited to a love story than a neighbor's eulogy. Another obituary declared that her life's greatest solace was the unwavering companionship of Miss Name, with whom she shared every hour, sorrow, and season. It sounds ordinary until you read it again slowly. In some cases, the tributes went even further. Surviving partners arranged for gravestones to be carved with shared quotes, matching symbols, or even side-by-side plots, an unusual practice for women who were neither sisters nor spouses. One particularly moving headstone reads, "Together in life, together in memory, carved beneath a pair of interlocked initials." Yet, for every visible tribute there were a dozen quiet gestures maintaining the other's room untouched, preserving letters in ribbon-tied boxes, or continuing a routine like walking the garden path, alone each morning, out of respect, not habit. Scholars continue to interpret these eulogies in different ways. Some argue they were simply products of Victorian sentimentality, a time when everyone wrote like they were drafting a sonnet. Others believe they represent deliberate efforts to honor a love that had no legal name. One thing is certain, these women found ways to say goodbye that honored the magnitude of their connection. Sometimes friends of the deceased would pen lengthy remembrances in reform journals or literary magazines describing the partnership as a union of souls unshaken by time. These tributes served not only as elegy, but as preservation, ensuring that someone somewhere would remember that their life wasn't lived alone. Of course, not all public responses were sympathetic. Some obituaries omitted the surviving partner, entirely erasing decades of shared life in favor of distant cousins or more socially acceptable names. In those moments, grief became doubly painful loss compounded by invisibility. But even in these erasures, the love found ways to linger. In a line of poetry quoted without attribution, in a photo where one woman stands just slightly in front of the other, in a pressed flower tucked into the back of a drawer, because grief, when it has no title, becomes poetry. And in those obituaries filled with her dearest companion, the unsaid often speaks loudest. You enter a meeting hall modest echoing with whispers and the scratch of quills. Posters line the walls, calls to end slavery, to temper, drink to educate girls. At the front, two women sit shoulder to shoulder, their voices soft but firm. They are not just activists, they are a unit. One speaks, the other records, and together they rally a room that might otherwise dismiss them. Many of the most effective 19th century reform efforts had women at their core, and among these, some of the most tireless were pairs of companions who merged their emotional bond with a shared cause. Whether advocating for abolition, suffrage, or temperance, these women turned their homes and their friendships into command centers for change. It wasn't just about leaflets or lectures. These women hosted salons, organized marches, and drafted petitions, all while maintaining a domestic rhythm that included shared meals and quiet evenings of correspondence. Their causes gave them a public voice, but it was their friendship that gave them stamina. One well-known example is the partnership between Susan B. Anthony and Anna Dickinson, whose lives frequently overlapped in the early suffrage movement. While not confirmed as romantic, their correspondence and collaboration reveal an emotional dependency that went far beyond strategy. "Your courage steadies me," Anthony once wrote, "even when the rest of the world trembles." That's more than political alignment. It's personal anchoring. Not every duo took to the stage. Some preferred quieter revolutions, co-authoring books, running community kitchens, teaching adult literacy classes together. Whatever the task, they moved as a pair, dividing duties not by skill, but by rhythm. One started the speech, the other picked up the thread. Like dancers who always knew the next step, historians continue to wrestle with how to define these partnerships. Were they marriages of convenience designed for logistical survival, or were they deliberate fusions of heart and purpose? There's no scholarly consensus, but the evidence is telling joint bank accounts, co-signed property deeds, and in many cases, coordinated burial plans. These women were not anomalies. Across the US and Europe, reformist circles were filled with female pairs who didn't just work together, they lived together. Their homes were often described as hubs of activity, though visitors frequently noted the unmistakable domesticity of their bond: two rocking chairs by the fire, two needlework frames in the corner, two cups set out before guests arrived. Occasionally, their political foes mocked these arrangements, accusing them of being unnatural or mannish. But more often, the public simply overlooked the intimacy, choosing to see efficiency instead of emotion. As long as they got results, the details of their living situations went politely unexamined. And so, these companions quietly rewrote the rules of protest, of domesticity, of female agency. They weren't just voices for reform. They were blueprints for what a chosen life could look like. Their friendships weren't side notes to history, they were engines. Because when love and purpose walk hand in hand, they don't need a parade. They build a movement. In a faded photograph, two women stand side by side beneath a flowering arch. They wear matching dresses, high-necked, puff-sleeved, trimmed in identical lace. Their hats tilt at the same angle, their gloved hands clasped loosely in front of them. At first glance, you might assume they're sisters. But look closer. Their eyes don't match. Their smiles are timed. Their clothing says, "We belong to each other." For many 19th century companion pairs, dressing alike wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a quiet declaration. Matching clothing allowed them to express unity in a world that offered no official label for their bond. It wasn't legal, it wasn't religious, but a gown in the same shade of sage green that could say what they couldn't. Often these coordinated outfits mirrored popular trends of the time: ruffled skirts, embroidered shawls, wide sashes, but the pairs made subtle tweaks: identical buttons, embroidered initials, or ribbons tied in opposite directions like puzzle pieces completing each other. Some pairs had portraits painted in matching attire, deliberately posed as visual echoes. Others wore coordinated outfits to social events, publicly twinning, in a way that both charmed and confused onlookers. Those two are always dressed like bookends, one guest reportedly whispered at a dinner party in 1874. The remark was meant as a joke, but it wasn't wrong. Matching clothes weren't just symbolic, they were also strategic. In a time when same-sex intimacy was not legally recognized, appearing as an inseparable duo helped normalize their relationship in the public eye. Of course they lived together, neighbors would say. They've always dressed alike. Familiarity bred comfort, even if it didn't breed understanding. This visual bonding was especially common among women involved in artistic or academic circles. Poetesses, teachers, and reformers often used fashion to establish both their identity and their independence. A matched outfit became a suit of armor, feminine, yes, but unshakably unified. Some scholars interpret these clothing choices as a kind of resistance, a way to claim space and visibility without open confrontation. Others argue they were simply a product of the Victorian love for symmetry and sentiment. The debate continues over threads and seams, no less. But for the women involved, the act of dressing alike carried real emotional weight. It was part of the rhythm of their lives, like sharing meals or writing letters. Choosing fabric together, debating sleeve length, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the hem on someone else's skirt before your own. There's one recorded instance of a woman who wore black for the rest of her life after her companion died. Not just on Sundays, every day. She kept their last matching dress, folded in a trunk, scented with lavender, and locked with a small iron key. When asked why she never remarried, she simply replied, "I've already had my other half. Fashion fades, they say. But love, when stitched carefully into linen and lace, doesn't unravel so easily. Sometimes the best way to say you're mine is a needle and thread. In a quiet library alcove, you pull down a dust-coated novel with a cover worn soft at the corners. Inside, a heroine clutches another woman's hand, a little too tightly blushes in her presence, and writes pages of unsent letters before settling into a life of ambiguous longing. It's not spelled out, but it's there between the commas and ellipses. Fiction of the 19th century was often the safest place to explore forbidden emotions. With strict codes around public speech and printed morality, novelists learned to say the unsayable through subtle metaphors, coded glances, and deeply felt silences. And nowhere is this more evident than in the portrayal of intense female friendships, relationships that shimmer with more than platonic affection, but never tip fully into scandal. Writers like Charlotte Bronte, Louisa May Alcott, and even Henry James crafted characters whose same-gender relationships walk the delicate line between admiration and devotion. In Villette Bronte's heroine experiences an emotional pull toward another woman so vivid it borders on confession. In Little Women, Jo's bond with her friend Laurie is constantly debated, but her closeness with sisters and other women sometimes glows with even greater intimacy. These portrayals weren't necessarily conscious attempts to depict queer relationships. Some scholars argue that Victorian writers were simply mirroring the deep emotionally expressive friendships common among women of the time. Others suggest that fiction provided a socially acceptable mask, a place where authors and readers could safely indulge in feelings they weren't allowed to name. In fact, many companion pairs saw themselves in these characters. Marginalia in old books reveal scribbled hearts, underlined passages, and notes like Just Like Us. Literature became a mirror and a map reflecting their lives while also imagining what might be possible. Authors, too, sometimes lived the stories they wrote. Willa Cather, known for her novels about frontier life and strong female characters, lived with Edith Lewis for nearly 40 years. Their relationship was never openly defined, but in her letters, Cather spoke of Edith as her home, and in her fiction relationships between women take on a depth and tenderness that feels strikingly personal. Sometimes authors use fantasy to cloak reality. Women wrote Gothic tales filled with ghostly sisters, mysterious female figures, or enchanted domestic arrangements where no man was needed to complete the plot. These weren't just literary flourishes, they were coded hopes whispered into the language of metaphor. Modern readers often debate whether these fictional friendships were meant to be romantic. Some insist the authors had no such intent. Others believe they wrote what they dared and left the rest to us. The truth likely floats somewhere in the murky space between intention and interpretation. But even if the words love or desire never appear, the emotional gravity is clear. Two women standing too close. A sudden tear. A sentence cut short just when it turns toward confession. In the end, fiction did what society could not. It gave these relationships a stage, a voice, and at least on the page, a kind of legitimacy. Because sometimes a story is the safest place to tell the truth. The second teacup sits untouched. The rocking chair moves slightly as if from habit, but the room is silent now, except for the ticking of the old mantel clock, the same one they wound every Sunday together. One woman has gone, and the other remains holding everything they shared in her hands, and nothing that could legally bind her to it. When one half of a companionate bond died, the surviving woman was often left in a peculiar state of grief. There were no official titles to anchor her sorrow. No widowhood, no inheritance rights, no formal rituals of mourning. And yet her heart ached with all the weight of a bereaved spouse, perhaps more for the very invisibility of her loss. Many of these women found themselves navigating bureaucracies that didn't recognize their role. Without legal kinship, they couldn't make funeral arrangements, inherit jointly held homes, or even retrieve their companions' possessions. A woman who had lived beside another for 40 years might be excluded from the will in favor of a distant male cousin. Even death, it seemed, required a marriage certificate. Still, they found ways to mourn. Some wore black for months or years without being expected to. Others continued the household routines alone, setting out 2 teacups, folding laundry in pairs, keeping the garden exactly as it had been. The grief was not just emotional, it was tactile. It clung to scarves echoed in footsteps, lingered in notes left on the kitchen table. One particularly poignant case tells of a woman who, after her companion died, wrote her name every morning in a fresh journal, as if keeping her alive through repetition. "I hear her slippers in the hallway," she wrote. She would laugh at how quiet it's become. It wasn't melodrama. It was survival mourning without a map. Historians remain divided on whether these expressions of grief indicate romantic loss or simply the collapse of a primary emotional support. But that debate, academic as it is, often misses the point. These women lived as pairs. They planned meals, decorated parlors, raised nieces, and hosted holidays as a unit. When one died, the other wasn't just losing a friend. She was losing a life partner, whether or not society acknowledged it. Occasionally, the surviving woman would commission something to honor the bond, a bench with their names carved into it, a charity established in the other's name. One woman built a rose garden where each plant bore the name of a shared memory: tea in Paris storm, in Cornwall anniversary. They never had an anniversary, not officially, but every year on the same date, they had celebrated it anyway, with lilacs and a walk by the river. There is no section in etiquette manuals for this kind of grief. No polite phrases for, "I have lost my everything and no one noticed." And so many simply stayed silent, letting the void speak for itself. Because when your love is invisible, your mourning must be quiet. But it is no less real. Scholars gather around tables with fraying notebooks and thick-framed glasses, pointing at footnotes and phrases like deep affection or inseparable. Their voices are calm, but underneath simmers decades of disagreement. What exactly were these relationships? Friendships, partnerships, proto-queer unions? The record books refuse to say. And so, the debates continue quietly academic, yet charged with personal stakes. There is no singular interpretation of 19th century companionate bonds between women. Some historians argue they were early expressions of what we would now recognize as romantic or queer relationships, hidden beneath layers of social acceptability and coded language. Others insist they were simply intense, emotionally rich friendships, made possible by the cultural norms of the time. Victorian society, after all, encouraged sentimentality, especially among women. You were expected to feel deeply right passionately, and express loyalty with flowery language. Holding hands, sleeping in the same bed, even exchanging love letters was often seen as innocent. Yet modern readers can't help but read between the lines, spotting emotional resonance that feels undeniably romantic. Take the phrase Boston marriage, respectable on the surface, yet loaded with implications. It described 2 unmarried women living together long-term, often financially and emotionally interdependent. The public explanation, practicality. The private reality. No one really knows. Some of these relationships appear to have been non-sexual, others quietly romantic. The records are partial at best, filtered through the biases of time, modesty, and burned diaries. Some letters, particularly the more intimate ones, have vanished entirely, destroyed by family members or censored in posthumous publications. Surviving scraps often contradict themselves. One woman might call her companion the joy of my soul in one letter and refer to her merely as my dearest friend in another. Scholars comb through these inconsistencies like archaeologists piecing together a shattered amphora, unsure if they're restoring a vase or a lantern. There are also cultural blind spots. Many historians of past decades projected their own norms onto these relationships, insisting they must have been platonic because the women involved were ladylike or respectable. But newer scholarship takes a more nuanced view, acknowledging that love doesn't always conform to modern categories. Some call these relationships queer, before queerness a phrase that invites empathy rather than certainty. The debate isn't just academic. It touches real questions about identity, memory, and erasure. How do we honor relationships that lack the language to define themselves? Can we call them romantic if they never said so explicitly? Or are we imposing our own framework on lives lived under different rules? What's clear is that these bonds matter deeply to the women involved. Whether or not they kissed, whether or not they shared a bed, they built lives around one another. They raised each other's children, buried each other's pets, named each other in wills, and left behind homes still filled with paired gloves and identical teacups. The debate may never be settled, and maybe it doesn't need to be, because sometimes the truest measure of love isn't what you call it, but how long it lingers after the door clicks shut. In the back of an old library sits a shelf labeled Local Women's Societies, its binders faded and catalog numbers handwritten. Flip through the pages and you'll find meeting minutes, donation lists, perhaps a sketch of a garden layout. But read carefully, and certain names appear again and again, always together, always planning, hosting, deciding. Their friendship didn't fade with age. It built institutions. Many companion pairs left behind more than letters and lace. They left legacies small, sturdy, and often overlooked. From libraries and social clubs to charitable hospitals and art circles, these women helped shape the civic and cultural backbone of their communities. And they did it quietly, signing their names side by side. Take the case of Harriet and Louise, lifelong partners in both household and mission. They co-founded a women's reading room in 1881, eventually expanding it into a full lending library. Their names are still on the donor plaque, Miss Harriet W. and Miss Louise G., patrons of knowledge. Locals assumed they were spinster sisters. The women never corrected them. Across town, another pair, Anna and Bernice, ran a vocational training home for working girls. They taught cooking, sewing, and arithmetic. When Bernice passed away, Anna turned their parlor into a memorial classroom, complete with portraits and a plaque that read, "Her wisdom was my daily bread." It's easy to miss, but once seen it changes everything. Some women willed their joint savings towards scholarship funds or shelters. Others left behind gardens designed together, down to the placement of each rose bush. These weren't just gifts. They were living memorials, places where the rhythm of their shared days could echo on even without them. And yet, the official records rarely tell the full story. Archives list them as co-founders or cohabitants, never as partners in the deeper sense. Their photographs, often preserved in formal poses with hands clasped or arms lightly touching, are filed under civic contributors, their intimacy blurred into bureaucratic lines. Historians now dig through those records with more attentive eyes. They see the repeated signatures, the shared bank accounts, the mirrored handwriting on organizational notes. Each pairing is a thread, and together they weave a broader story, that of women who built more than private devotion, they built public good. Some scholars call these contributions invisible architecture, the social scaffolding constructed by bonds that had no legal recognition but tremendous influence. Whether through education, health, or the arts, these pairs often poured their mutual devotion into lasting institutions. And for every library still standing, every scholarship still awarded, there's a story underneath of two women who chose each other in a world that didn't quite know what to do with that choice. Their legacy isn't always inscribed in stone. Sometimes it's just a line in an old ledger, or a matching pair of rocking chairs stored in a museum basement, unlabeled but unmistakable. Because love, when lived quietly but deliberately, can leave its mark in the most enduring places between the shelves, beneath the roses, and stitched gently into the world they built together. The fire has dimmed, and the last teacup rests empty on the table, catching the soft hush of twilight. The women we've met tonight may have been written out of headlines and censuses, but their presence lingers in shared gardens and forgotten letters, in two names carved close on a bench worn smooth by time. Their lives were stitched together in gestures and glances, in routines too quiet to make noise, but loud enough to last. Whether history called them friends or partners, they lived on their own terms in homes of their choosing with love that didn't need permission. So, as you drift off, let your mind wander down ivy-wrapped streets past drawn curtains and matching chairs. Somewhere in that silence, two hearts beat together, softly and still. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?